artificial intelligence in healthcare is enormous, right? There are thousands of different use cases and technologies, right? So being able to use things like large language models that can perhaps mine trusted data about some of these procedures that are being recommended and find out the details about what things might be the most important to talk about with this patient based on their risk profiles. Right. So you could definitely see the difference between a cookie cutter consent, right, which is like boilerplate, which is the same form that you use, whether it's foot surgery or whether it's open heart surgery, it's the same hospital consent versus a highly detailed, highly individualized document that sort of raises attention to the things that might be important to that patient.
Welcome to the Digital Healthcare Experience, brought to you by Taylor Healthcare. Subscribe now and stay on the forefront of the digital healthcare revolution.
Hello and welcome to the Digital Healthcare Experience podcast presented by Taylor Healthcare. I'm your host, Chris Civitaris, and today I'm joined by Chad Brouillard, medical malpractice defense trial attorney, healthcare lawyer, and partner at the law firm of Foster Eldridge, LLP in Massachusetts. Chad has written extensively on health information technology liability, including with respect to electronic medical records and artificial intelligence, and speaks internationally on these topics. He was the course creator and adjunct professor at Tufts University School of Medicine Public Health Division, where he taught information governance in healthcare for several years. He's licensed in New Hampshire, New York, Massachusetts, and with our federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court. Welcome, Chad. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Chris. It's good to be here. Always nice to talk with you.
Always great to have you, and I'm super excited to dive into this because obviously, as some of our listeners know, Taylor is among the leading providers of digital informed consent solutions, and whenever you and I talk, I always walk away learning something new. So with that, we can jump in here. You've spent your career on the front lines of medical malpractice defense. Can you share a little bit more about your background and your work at the intersection of tech, AI, and all things medical malpractice defense?
Sure. My story is kind of one of those stories of I was doing certain things at points of my career and everything kind of came together at the end for a reason, I suppose. But before I even became a lawyer, I happened to just be working in an area during the .com era where there was a lot of venture capital and I got a lot of tech experience very early on, and then eventually became a lawyer and was really interested in being a trial lawyer. And it just so happens that medical malpractice is one of the few areas where you can try cases as a civil lawyer, which is what I wanted to do. And it just so happened I became a medical malpractice attorney just when they dropped EHRs. So I could see from my tech background what a big game changer this was going to be. And it's something I've pursued my entire career as a lawyer, where I've written many articles, I've worked on federal grant programs, kind of tracing out the issues of electronic health records and medical liability issues. And that sort of has blossomed organically over the years, to encompass other things such as telehealth, AI, wherever the tech basically goes. And it's something that I'm very interested in, follow to this day.
Yeah, and I know consent obviously is, again, one of the areas that you focus on. So let's start there. Conventionally, informed consent has been, a one-time kind of form-driven event rather than a process. And we have, as you described, technologies that are coming in and affecting pretty much every facet of medicine. So I'm curious specifically how you see AI impacting some of those traditional processes around things like informed consent.
Sure. It's funny when you talk about consent and AI in that context. In some ways, it's a very dual-edged sword, or maybe two sides to a different coin, because we can talk about AI assisting the process of consent in a much more detailed way than that might even be possible from a human, right? Who's stressed out physician who's just trying to get a consent for a surgical procedure, and it may not have all the right information. It may not be very personalized, because they're trying to fulfill a request for a great number of people, and there are limitations to how specific they can make that, as you well know, right? So,
Absolutely.
AI can really assist with, real time consent generation, or, some of the things that I think are really cool about how AI can help the process of consent, where patients can understand or even have a conversation with their consent to make sure that they know what they're signing up for and that they understand the medicine, or maybe, provided models and visuals and the whole nine yards. So I think it's very exciting from that viewpoint. But I would say the flip side of it too, talking about AI and consent, is that we really have to think about, well, wait a minute, if healthcare is really employing this technology all across its enterprise, does the patient have a say as to whether or not these AI tools should be used relative to their care? Can they opt out? Or do physicians affirmatively need to gather a consent before the use of an AI? Let's say it's an intervention, right? So something that would fall under the rubric of a traditional consent. Now does the clinician really have to disclose to the patient the use of AI and obtain their consent? So I think those two topics together are really interesting, because I think there are implications both on the process of consent, but also substantively as to whether AI itself requires a separate consent.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and you hit on a couple of threads here. I guess first, I want to explore a little bit further around the technologies and tools and things like that are making this space more personalized. I think anytime that we talk AI, one of the outcomes of AI and technology sort of accelerating in general is that medicine is becoming more personal. So, talk to us a little bit about how some of these new tools are making consent and shared decision making more personal from your point of view.
Yeah, of course. And I like the way you frame that question too, because I think when we talk about AI, one of the things that can be a little bit overwhelming is artificial intelligence in healthcare is enormous, right? There are thousands
Right.
of different use cases and technologies, right? So, and some of them are not the same, some of them do very different things. But I think what you and I are really talking about when it comes to the AI space and informed consent is being able to use things like large language models that can perhaps mine an EHR, or mine, databases with like trusted data about some of these procedures that are being recommended. And, so you have a very sturdy foundation with built on quality data, but it's trying to, scrape the EHR and find out the details about what things might be the most important to talk about with this patient based on their risk profiles, right? So that's the type of stuff that I think a clinician working in the trenches, when they're fashioning a consent, might miss the things that are very personalized, because it takes a lot of time. You might have to review an entire patient's chart to kind of understand some of the, very personalized risk factors that you might want to draw their attention to before obtaining consent for a procedure. But a large language model, obviously, that's what it does. It consumes a large amount of data and then is able to, very spit back those variables to you and allow you to have a conversation with the patient's medical history, right? So I think in that context, these developing technologies have a lot of promise to make the care delivery a lot more personalized and a lot more engaging to the patients, I think. And so you could definitely see the difference between a cookie cutter consent, right, which is like boilerplate, which is the same form that you use for, whether it's foot surgery or whether it's open heart surgery. It's the same hospital consent, versus a highly detailed, highly individualized document that sort of raises attention to the things that might be important to that patient.
I love that the way that you describe that. I mean, it's really interesting because we've gone from a point where, we have sort of informed consent, generalized, right? Whether we're operating on the foot or whether we're operating on the heart, it's kind of the same form, to, this notion of, content specific to that particular procedure based on, evidence-based medicine, right? The risks for this procedure generally are A, B, C, D, and E. And we were describing, it sounds like it's kind of the next evolution in that kind of roadmap to say, well, yeah, here's kind of the baseline for what we can expect for this procedure, but the marriage between the procedure, the patient, and the expected outcomes based on that individual patient profile is something that's a really exciting prospect in terms of not just medical malpractice, but if I think about that from a patient's perspective, a very deep understanding of what might happen to me and why. And from a provider's perspective, that's an even more intimate conversation that I can have from a shared decision making perspective. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Chris, I think the other thing, importantly, I imagine is going to develop is the idea that the patients, as I sort of hinted at before, kind of can have a conversation with their consent, right? So if you have an AI tool which brings up a consent and then engages in a discussion, right, with the patient using a chatbot or whatever to make sure that they understand the key components and providing learning on the fly, right? If they
Absolutely.
need more information about this topic, please see this short video, see this short article. I think there's a lot of potential in this space.
So that's really interesting. And I guess from my point of view, that kind of leads to a couple of follow-ups here. Given what the technology is capable of today and the breakneck pace, right, that it's accelerating and evolving and so on, I mean, it's going to be that much more impressive, impactful a year, 3 years, 5 years from now. I think about, what that interaction between a patient and the technology means in terms of tailoring explanations at certain literacy levels in certain languages for certain patient specific conditions and comorbidities. So I guess what does it mean, both from I'll call it an opportunity perspective with these types of advances, but then also, does that raise the bar from a legal perspective? What are the risks that you see with those types of innovations? Take us through that landscape if you could.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it does move the needle in terms of something we've talked about a lot, right, Chris, about it's not a form informed consent.
Right.
It's a process and making it a better process. I think I've always kind of thought of this structurally. The way that we do informed consent legally and medically is sort of wrongheaded in a way, right? You might have a excellent surgeon who has excellent hands, who is doing the technical part of the procedure, and they might just be one of those people who has terrible communication skills, right? I don't
Right.
need my surgeon to be the best communicator in the world. I mean, it's nice if they have both, but that's not what's required for that skill set. And we now
Right.
are sort of developing a technology that can kind of take the place of that process, right? We're credibly take the place of that process and maybe provide better patient education about these complicated topics just by the nature of the technology itself, right? Where you can have a discussion that's tailored, as you pointed out, for literacy level, for cultural preferences, for language preferences, and can better relate to the patient and better convey information. The way that I sort of think about this is, kind of early on in my career, I was really impressed by practitioners who, when they looked at the informed consent process, they really looked away from the form, right? And they really thought about what are some of the tools we can provide to make this more concrete to the patient. Like here's a model of the human skeleton that I'm going to be operating on. Here's exactly what I'm going to show you what I'm doing. Or here's this video that I make everybody watch about this procedure so that you can understand. And
Right.
I feel AI has a tremendous potential to really move the needle much more in that direction of providing this supplemental information so that you have a truly informed patient. And, whether it'd be interesting. You could even like build in where the AI chatbot is giving like a little quiz at the end to make sure that they understand. But that's really the goal. The goal is not to have this one human being, right, deliver a performance about informed consent. Really, the goal is that there's a meeting of the minds and that there's understanding. And so any of these supplemental tools are great. Relative to are we changing the standard? That's a really great question, and a really impactful question when we're talking about AI and medical malpractice, medical legal liability, because new technologies always sort of can change the standard of care. And early on, you may have arguments if you're an early adopter of this technology, like, oh, this wasn't vetted, or this isn't proven, and not a lot of
Right.
people are using it. So you don't want to be the first in line necessarily, but you also don't want to be the last in line, right? At some point,
Right.
we're going to say using AI for whatever purposes, consent or, a thousand of other use cases, has become the standard of care 10 years from now, right? So the standard of care is very malleable in that way. So I'm sure we're going to be hearing arguments, about the use, the misuse, the non-use of artificial intelligence in a variety of potential medical legal concepts. But obviously, informed consent, I think, will be one of those.
It's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that we talk a lot about is kind of the synchronous versus the asynchronous, quote unquote, conversations that happen between a patient and the health system in general, right? The provider organization. And what you're describing, some of these tools may lend themselves to using asynchronous conversations, quote unquote, kind of, loosely termed, to make those those synchronous conversations between two human beings maybe more impactful. And I think, as you pointed out, we've seen some physicians along the way, some surgeons along the way, implement those other tools in terms of, patient education. Watch this video. Here's the video that we showed everybody doing this procedure, so on. And again, I think that the notion of what happens synchronously and asynchronously in that conversation, my experience is that people see those things sort of in opposition of each other. That if I'm doing things asynchronously, it takes time away from that patient-provider conversation. But I think you're describing those two things living in a lot better harmony, if you will. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think if you look at the rollout of ambient scribing, I'll use that as an example, because I think initially there was a lot of pushback about what happens with open notes if we give patients real-time access to our records. And the physician concerns kind of what you're saying, right? Like, oh, it's going to detract from our in-person, it's going to take more time, it's not going to, patient engagement will be lower, it's going to be more laborious for us, or they're going to get confused by the medical information that they're reviewing. But the open notes study basically said the reverse of all that, right? Like actually having real-time access increases patient engagement and allows them to have a more effective synchronous conversation with the provider. And, I think to the extent that you have a better educated consumer, in this case, a patient, right? When they're in the room with the decision makers about whether to go forward with an intervention, if they are more empowered and more knowledgeable about the decision that's before them, I think that's really the goal, right?
Absolutely.
That makes for a better patient experience. But also, I think there's, a large segment of what we see in medical malpractice, usually around these surgical interventions, right? Where there can be a mismatch of expectations because the patient had expectations which were not aligned with reality in terms of the potential risks, the potential consequences, the potential recovery periods, right? So I think the more that you can sort of provide this to patients up front and have them engaged with it and make sure that they understand, you're going to have a more harmonious relationship with your provider because everything has been kind of spelled out and you've been educated on the topic in a very sophisticated, individualized way. So, that would be the hope with the technology as it develops along here, is that we get to that point where you have a fully empowered, engaged experience, which, I think the whole point of a lot of these technologies has been trying to move the needle towards a patient-centric view of healthcare delivery. And this would be another step along the way.
Absolutely. And I love the way that you described earlier kind of the spectrum of AI. And I mean, it cuts across virtually every single aspect of healthcare and across our lives in general in terms of the changes and the improvements that are coming. And certainly, I assume that within the informed consent context, that's also a bit of a spectrum of AI use.
Sure.
Could you give us a little bit more about what that might look like in terms of that spectrum related to informed consent?
Yeah, well, so let me just take a step back generally to describe, just so that we're all on the same baseline here. When I'm talking about the spectrum, right? So you can have, there's just so many use cases for the technology. So, it really kind of started with pattern recognition and radiology and pathology and things like that. Those are very easy sort of first use cases because you have very high quality data, right? So it makes it sort of amenable to those technologies. And then as you get further down the line and you have an electronic health record and you have all of this narrative free text, that gets much more difficult to build an algorithm, a traditional algorithm around, right? So that's where we're dealing with these large language models. But in terms of spectrum of use, I think one of the issues as it pertains to informed consent is where it's so ubiquitous in the healthcare space, in our lives, really, right? You can't compose an email or compose a Word document in normal life without, or search something online without interacting with an AI technology. And you might not even realize it. And I think that part is true in healthcare, but also creates a special issue relative to informed consent, because I think what we want to be clear about is, it's not as if the clinician necessarily has to get informed consent because they're using a grammar checker, right?
Right.
These algorithms are everywhere. It's more so, I think in most states, at least, they view the informed consent process to be most valuable when you're proposing some type of intervention. So in my mind, if you're using an AI as sort of a surrogate for, human judgment, it probably is something that you might want to consider as part of the informed consent discussion. To give you a very, very clear example, for, if you're using a robotic surgery and you have sort of like AI cruise control, or collision detection, like that equivalent for some of the surgical tools when they're around surrounding structures, that might be something that's worth talking about as part of the informed consent process. About, here are some of the tools we're using. But on the other end of the spectrum is the when I'm in the patient portal, I'm using a grammar checker that's AI generated. Like, obviously, like some of the stuff, I don't think qualifies for an out and out discussion. And I think we want to be sort of careful in this space too. I think when it comes to AI technologies, we can be, maybe rightfully so at this stage because things are so new, but I think we can be sort of over strict on AI. So for instance, if you look at some of the error rates, it's like over humans, right? But yet
Right.
we feel safer that humans are making the mistakes as opposed to the technology. I think it's like something inherent in us. We don't like that the technology is necessarily making mistakes. But yeah, so it really depends. I think the other special issue I would talk about relative to informed consent in AI in this space is really having to be honest and knowledgeable about what happens with patient data, right?
Right.
So there are so many tools on the market. As you know, we've gone to some of these large technology conferences where there are football fields worth of vendors all selling AI products. And, some of them are very good, right? But I'm sure some of them
Right.
are not. And some of them have sound security practices and recognize patient privacy and have come up with ways to handle that, whether they sandbox or, whatever it is they do, but they don't store or collect your patient data. And I think there has to be transparency around what it is, if you're employing an AI tool, what it is that you're doing with patient data and making it part of your privacy practices or a consent if it, rises to that intervention level. So those are some overall thoughts I would have about AI and informed consent in that regard.
I think it's great. And there's a thread that I want to go a little bit deeper on. So you talked about how some of these tools are increasingly getting, I'll say, embedded into the clinical ecosystem of technology that physicians or providers deal with. Sometimes to the point where the physicians themselves, as you say, might not even realize that there's something kind of running. AI scribes, I think, is maybe a good example, and I'm sure that there are many others. But that's a really interesting kind of nuance that seems to add to the process, both for patients in terms of, as you described, what you disclose to those patients, but also doesn't that kind of change the way that physicians may look at this space in terms of medical malpractice, the tools that are running that they may not have complete awareness or understanding of in the background, and where that all shakes out? So what are some of those nuances if I think about those embedded clinical tools, those embedded AI tools in the clinical process? What does that do to this whole thing?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a really good question right now, Chris, because I think 3 weeks ago, without naming names, some of the major electronic medical record companies rolled out AI agent tools
That's right.
embedded into their electronic medical record via a software update, right? So
Right.
this is not an AI tool that a hospital or a practice pre-purchased and considered and vetted and tested, as we see kind of in a lot of these standalone products. This is their existing electronic health record throwing out a patch And all of a sudden, you have embedded AI agents who are composing part of the note, right? So it raises a real question for physicians about how are they supposed to know what part of their notes is AI generated. I mean, I think it's different if you're doing full on ambient scribing, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
you're using a standalone product and you know that you have to review the note. And
Right.
I think that's one workflow and process, but it's another thing to be capturing information in the EHR and you think you're generating a note, you hit print, and an AI agent has filled out a patient medical history summary at the top. And then you're
Right.
in litigation later and you're shown this note and you look at the patient, history information, you're like, who drafted that? I didn't do that. Like, I don't even know where this came from. And we've seen this play out in EHRs already. This is, I'm trying to think of a way to summarize the kind of a more complex discussion. But, in essence, if you think about it, physician notes kind of started off as like handwritten notes to themselves, right? They were really
Right.
short, but they were thoughts captured in handwriting largely. And then once we got to electronic medical records, a lot of outside influences started adding a lot of content that was required into those notes. Whether you're talking about payors, we need these 6 tables filled out for every patient. And then, the administration, there can be a lot of different hands that creates a template in an EHR and affects the information that's being recorded and sometimes pre-generates information that the
Right.
clinician is kind of stuck with. I think in the AI space, that's going to take that issue and make it an exponential one where you add in a layer like ambient scribing. So now the clinician doesn't even see a note until the end of the process. And let me just kind of put out there as a caveat, I will tell you in the electronic medical record space, I cannot tell you how long I saw this play out with dictation, right? Where I would see these caveats at the end, basically saying, we don't review our notes for inaccuracies or typos,
Right.
right? We're going to see this in the same space, with AI generated notes. So
Yeah.
I think it makes it very difficult for the clinician about how are you able to disclose to a patient AI use when you're not even sure what AI is running behind the scenes and where it's everywhere across your ecosystem. And then the third issue being, look, you went to medical school, right? You're not a computer scientist. So it's hard to be transparent when you don't even understand how these tools basically function or how they function, right? So yeah, I think it's a very good question that's going to play out over the next 10 years as we try to sort through this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious about your perspective on, I'll say, kind of like the policy and legal backdrop of where we are kind of right now and what you're keeping an eye on for the future. As you say, I mean, a lot of the litigation around this space it's starting to be tested, but it's really largely yet to be tested, right? And we know that the policy angle of this, in terms of CMS and all the other sort of bodies that care about what happens in healthcare, there's always a lag between the technology itself, the pace that it accelerates, and the legal cases and examples, and also the policy. So if you can, educate our listeners about where we are right now in terms of those legal tests and the backdrop of policy and what the federal government is doing and states are doing. And what are you keeping an eye on for the future in that backdrop of policy or of legal precedent?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think let me take up the present first, right?
Yeah.
So I think where we are now is in a space of very little regulation. I think probably no meaningful federal regulation. ONC has a
Right.
few things on things like predictive interventions, but decision interventions. But I don't think credibly we have a framework. I don't think the government has their arms around what this is, right?
That's right.
So you have, I think, some siloed segments of states who are being aggressive about trying to come up with some laws, particularly around things like patient privacy or the use of AI in health insurance context for things like claims denials, right? So
Right.
we have some of that going on, but I think by and large, our age is a one of unrestricted Wild West, AI freedom because,
Right.
for a lot of reasons, but that's where we are now. So I think the current paradigm of medical malpractice law and agency and liability, I think can handle sort of what's mostly current in AI under the view that it's kind of like another tool in the arsenal. Um,
Right.
so I think that's by and large how a lot of these cases are being dealt with, that it's just another one tool among many that a clinician may or may not employ.
Right.
But I don't think the space is going to stay there,
Hmm.
because if you look where most of the investment is going in the healthcare industry relative to AI tools, it's really focusing on AI first, triage, AI first delivery of care. So taking
Right.
the doctor and putting them behind an AI. So if you have AI technologies, AI agents essentially acting as a triage nurse, right? You can make a very credible legal argument, I think, that is going to fly in some courts, which is, I don't care if it's human. I don't care if it's a robot. The standard of care, the medical standard of care is the standard of care, right? So if we can
Right.
prove that your AI agent in triaging my patient, my client, didn't take into account these factors, and then something bad happened to this patient, you can see plaintiff's attorney's argument that we should be holding AI to the same human standard of care for physicians if they're going to
Absolutely.
be, or nurses, if they're going to be emulating the functions of human agents, right? And there's actually, funny enough, AI is kind of one of these weird spaces. It's not like electronic health records in the sense that electronic health records hit the scene and there was nothing like it before, and it really changed a lot of things. And legally, we had to, learn how to grip with things like audit trails, and the law had to sort of adjust. But AI is a different space because the FDA approved the first AI medical device in 1995, right?
Yeah.
It was an older form of what we would call smart technology, right? That's it, but it was algorithm based pattern recognition. It falls within the definition of AI. So we've had a history and a corpus of cases that have come around that have dealt with some of these algorithms. There was a really interesting case out of New Jersey in which there was an AI tool which help physicians generate a differential diagnosis based on
Hmm.
symptoms. And in that particular case, the court, and this was going back to 2012, right? So gentlemen, let me just preface this. This is going back to 2012. The court allowed the plaintiff to sue the software manufacturer under the theory that I described, that if
Wow.
it was generating a differential diagnosis, that's an essential function of a clinician. So we don't care whether it was human or it's robot, right? Where it's being held to the same standard of care. So you couple that sort of background with the heavy investment to AI first agents that, may be standing between you and even being seen by a doctor, or maybe the entity that's responding to, in the first instance, to your patient portal messaging, right? I think
Right.
it really lends itself to expanding liability towards the AI vendors in this space if their tools are providing primary clinical functions in that way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I remember there was a conversation that happened at HIMSS. I think it was maybe 3 HIMSS ago. And there was an attorney, I think actually a barrister. I think she was a barrister in the UK, if I'm not mistaken. And she asked a fascinating question around AI and effectively consent. It's, who do you sue? So that
Right.
becomes a really, really interesting conversation in terms of, are you introducing new parties to these potential suits, in terms of the technology providers or the folks that are providing the LLMs at the core of the technology products. And that's a really kind of complicated web that it seems like we can get into.
Yeah, no, of course. I think we're at the cusp of there being a real change at the way that, 'cause traditionally, if you have a old school software program, non AI being used, and you say the software caused some patient harm, it's tremendously difficult, I think, for plaintiffs to sue the software company for a
Right.
variety of reasons. But one of them is we have a construct about, or a paradigm and doctrine about how we prosecute products liability cases. And it's a lot more complicated than a medical malpractice case. And it very often requires you to establish through technical experts who have sifted through your code and are able to point to some sort of design defect. So those cases are much more costly to bring. And so in this space, I think traditionally plaintiffs' attorneys have tried to stay away from things like software vendors because they don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
Plus, they have a special defense called the learned intermediary defense, which essentially allows them to say, hey, our software is like a scalpel. It's like any other tool in the doctor's arsenal. They choose when to use it. They exercise their professional judgment, and they choose when to use it. So therefore, that should cut off liability to the product's manufacturer. So it raises some significant hurdles, I think, if really a plaintiff's or patient's recourse is to go after the AI software vendor, because they're going to have some powerful defenses that they can use under the traditional model. But this sort of emerging way of thinking about, hey, it doesn't matter whether it's a human or whether it's an AI product, if it's providing frontline medical advice, shouldn't it be held to our same standards? By the way, also, I think on the medical side, there's a big debate about how we should be testing these things, right? Do we treat them as software products, and do we do rigorous data testing, on the front end and the back end? Or if it's performing a clinical function, should we make it take, like board certification exams and to test how high quality the data it's based upon? So we're kind of approaching this really interesting space where there's a blurring of the lines between, applying standards that would typically traditionally only be applied to human beings and applying them directly to our technologies because they're starting to emulate us.
So fascinating. Chad, this has been just a wonderful conversation. And I know we're almost out of time here, but to close it out, anything else that you're working on, excited about, anything at all that you want to share with the community as a closing thought here?
Well, I mean, just, basically I'm continuing on this track of going around the country, speaking to a lot of different people in the healthcare space, in informatics, gathering a lot of information and thoughts at a lot of these conferences. And it's really wonderful to have had this opportunity and this background. So I really am looking forward to see where some of these questions are going to go, and looking to see at the potential of, a lot of these products, and are they going to improve the quality of patient care? So really that's what I'm continuing doing, is continuing the conversations with some really great folks. And, again, just want to thank you, Chris, and thank Taylor for having me back. And yeah, this has been a really great conversation.
It's always a pleasure. And as you mentioned, this is not our first time talking. Chad was one of our hosts of a webinar that we've done in the past. So if you want to learn a little bit more about some of the topics that Chad addressed today, we'll go ahead and Chad will link the recording of some of those other things we've done together in the show notes here on the channel. But it was a wonderful conversation, as it always is. Such a pleasure having you on. And thank you so much again for taking the time here with us today.
Very welcome, Chris. Take care.
And thank you also to our listeners. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like, share, and subscribe to help us keep growing the show. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Taylor Healthcare and the digital healthcare experience, you can go to taylor.com/digital-healthcare. That's our show for today. And until next time, this is Chris Civitarice wishing you health and good cheer. Take care.
To learn more about Taylor Healthcare, please visit taylor.com/digital-healthcare. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is provided with the understanding that it does not constitute medical, legal, or financial advice or services. The Digital Healthcare Experience is produced by Naomi Schwimmer, podcast music by Nicholas Bach.
Informed consent is vital to patient care, but how can you help patients make informed decisions? Introducing iMed Health from Taylor Healthcare. Digital tools that standardize and simplify the informed consent process. Go to imedhealth.com to learn more. Find the link in the show notes.